Black Janitor got his billionaire boss pregnant and she denied him until she saw the baby's face. At first, this sounded like an impossible scandal, the kind of rumor whispered in dim hallways and dismissed as fantasy. But beneath the polished walls of power and wealth, secrets can grow like shadows, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. And this was one of those stories, messy, painful, and deeply tied to the truth of race, class, and injustice. She was a billionaire, a woman born into legacy wealth, her life shaped by power and luxury from the day she entered the world. She moved through marble mansions, glittering galas, and boardrooms filled with men twice her age who bowed their heads when she spoke. To the public, she was untouchable, a symbol of success, refinement, and superiority. Behind her smile, though, lived a streak of recklessness, a curiosity about the world outside her golden cage. He was a janitor, quiet and invisible to most who walked past him. Every day he scrubbed the same polished floors, emptied trash bins lined with discarded evidence of careless privilege, and mopped spills left behind by people who never even noticed his presence. He wore a green uniform with his name stitched on the chest, but to those who looked down on him, he was nameless, faceless, just another worker in a building that celebrated wealth and forgot humanity. His skin told a story the world had already judged before he ever opened his mouth. Their paths crossed in a way that was never meant to happen. The boardroom had been a stage for the wealthy that evening, laughter echoing off chandeliers as expensive champagne flowed endlessly. When the last guest drifted out, he entered quietly, his mop bucket rattling against the polished floor. She was still there, seated at the head of the long table, her heels dangling carelessly as if she owned not just the room, but the entire city. For once, she wasn't surrounded by admirers or bodyguards. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if suddenly aware that there was a human being behind the uniform. That night marked the beginning of a dangerous connection. At first, it was nothing more than small exchanges. A thank you, a glance that lingered a second longer than it should have, a sense of curiosity about the other. She was drawn to the strength in his arms, the quiet dignity in his movements, the way he never begged for attention the way so many in her world did. He was drawn to the rare kindness in her voice when she chose to use it, to the way she seemed tired of her own privilege yet chained to it. But society was not built to accept them together. To her friends, he was beneath her. To his peers, she was untouchable. And yet late nights became stolen moments. The sound of mops and brooms gave way to whispered confessions. The janitor, who had once been invisible, suddenly became the keeper of her secrets. And in those moments, stripped of titles and uniforms, they were just two human beings colliding in a world determined to keep them apart. Still, the truth of their worlds could not be denied. For her, he was nothing more than a fleeting escape from the suffocating expectations of wealth. For him, she was a dream, something too fragile and too dangerous to ever hold on to. Yet dreams have a way of bleeding into reality. Weeks turned into months, and whispers turned into actions that would change their lives forever. When she realized she was pregnant, her world shook. Not because of the life growing inside her, but because of what that life represented. In the silence of her penthouse, she stared into the mirror, clutching the pregnancy test, her mind racing with fear. What would people say if they knew? What would her family do if they discovered the father was the janitor who scrubbed their marble floors? In her world, reputation was everything, and his existence in her life threatened to tear it apart. He, on the other hand, saw the news with a mix of shock and hope. For him, it wasn't just about a baby. It was about belonging, about finally having a piece of love in a world that tried every day to erase him. He wanted to be there, to stand by her side, to claim the child as his own. But before he could even speak, she silenced him with denial. She refused to acknowledge him. To her family, her friends, and her world, she insisted the child had nothing to do with him. He was erased before he ever had the chance to exist as a father. The denial cut deep. He had never expected equality from her world, but he had hoped for honesty. Instead, he was left carrying the weight of shame she cast upon him, while she walked freely, cloaked in her wealth and power. The janitor became a shadow again, whispered about, judged, mocked quietly by those who noticed her swelling stomach and wondered about the truth. Yet secrets have a way of rising, and the day of reckoning would come sooner than she expected. As she lay in the hospital bed, the sterile white walls closing in, she prepared to bring life into a world built on lies. Nurses bustled around her, machines beeped steadily, and fear gripped her heart. She still believed she could control the narrative, that once the baby arrived, she could spin the story her way. But fate had its own plan, and no amount of money could rewrite what was about to happen. And so, as the minutes ticked closer to the child's arrival, two lives, one of privilege, one of labor, were about to collide in a way that could never again be hidden. The affair had begun as something fleeting, fragile like a candle flickering in the wind. But as weeks turned into months, their stolen encounters became the secret rhythm of their lives. In the shadow of skyscrapers and behind the closed doors of boardrooms, the janitor and the billionaire boss lived two different realities. Yet they clung to one another in moments that neither of them could explain away. For him, each meeting was both a gift and a wound. He knew the cost of their closeness. Every time he walked into the staff locker room, he heard the whispers, the sharp laughter of co-workers who suspected but didn't dare say too much. They warned him that people like her only saw people like him as entertainment, as an escape, as something disposable, and yet he couldn't turn away. His heart clung to the belief that what they shared was real, that he mattered to her beyond the secrecy of dimly lit rooms. For her, it was different. She told herself it was nothing serious, just a reckless rebellion against the golden cage she lived in. When she was with him, she felt human again, unchained from expectations. But the moment she stepped back into her world, she wore her mask of perfection once more. To her family, she was still the elegant daughter of wealth. To her business associates, she was still the untouchable boss. And in that double life, she convinced herself she could control everything. But control is fragile. One slip, one secret too heavy to carry, and everything collapses. The first sign of collapse came with the whispers among the household staff. They noticed how often she stayed late at the office, how her eyes softened when the janitor entered the room, how a woman who once never glanced at the workers suddenly found reasons to linger near him. Gossip spread like wildfire, upstairs, downstairs, across polished halls. And though the rich dismissed such talk as nonsense, she knew the walls were closing in. The day she discovered she was pregnant, the ground beneath her feet shook. She sat alone in her marble bathroom staring at the test, her heart pounding. Her first instinct was denial, not of the child itself, but of what it represented. Because in her world, bloodlines were everything. Heritage was currency. Reputation was worth more than truth. And a child with the janitor would be more than scandal. It would be the end of everything she had built her identity on, so she made a decision. To him, she offered nothing but silence. She avoided his gaze in hallways, cut off their late-night encounters, and buried herself in her work. When he finally confronted her, his eyes full of fear and hope, she looked at him with a coldness he had never seen before. She told him it wasn't his child, that he was imagining things, that he should stay in his place and stop chasing dreams that would never belong to him. Her words sliced deeper than she realized. For him, it wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. To be denied by the woman he trusted, to be silenced by her fear of shame, was a reminder of every door that had ever been slammed in his face. His skin had marked him as invisible his entire life, and now even his own child was being hidden from him. He tried to fight against the denial. He begged her to at least acknowledge the truth, to let him be part of his baby's life. But each attempt was met with sharper resistance. She reminded him who she was and who he was not. She reminded him of the gulf that divided them, a gulf built on money, status, and race. To her, he was nothing more than a mistake to be buried. As her pregnancy grew, the whispers turned louder. Behind closed doors, her family speculated. Friends raised their eyebrows. Some even dared to ask who the father was, but she brushed them aside with polished lies. She claimed it was an international businessman she had briefly dated, someone far away, someone untouchable. And the world accepted her story because it fit neatly into the narrative they already believed, that a woman like her could only ever be touched by someone of equal stature. But not everyone was fooled. The janitor's co-workers noticed how he carried himself differently now, how his eyes burned with anger and pain whenever her name came up. They noticed the timing, the way the puzzle pieces fit too perfectly. And though none of them spoke aloud, the silence was heavy with unspoken truths. Every day he went to work, scrubbing the same floors, walking the same halls, but now with a storm raging inside him. He watched as she glided through the building, her belly growing with the life he knew was his. She ignored him completely as though he didn't exist, as though their past had been nothing more than a hallucination. And that invisibility crushed him more than any insult ever could. Still, deep down, he clung to a single thread of hope, that the truth would reveal itself. That no matter how hard she tried to deny him, there would come a day when the world could no longer look away. The tension reached its breaking point one evening when she hosted a gala at her estate. The mansion sparkled with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed decor. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns filled the room with laughter and wine. She moved among them with the grace of royalty, her hand resting carefully on her stomach as though protecting her secret. But in the corner of the room, hidden among the staff in green uniforms, he watched. He watched as she laughed with men who had once courted her, as she accepted compliments on her glowing appearance, as she pretended everything was perfect. And in that moment he realized the cruelty of it all. Not only was he erased, but he was forced to serve at the table of his own denial. He was the one filling glasses, clearing plates, wiping spills, while his child grew inside the woman who refused to speak his name. The bitterness burned in his chest, but he stayed silent. Because he knew the world was not ready to hear his truth yet. And so the days stretched on, heavy with lies. She continued her charade, he continued his labor, and the world continued to spin, blind to the storm about to break. For beneath the surface of wealth and power, a reckoning was growing. And when the child was born, no amount of denial could keep the truth hidden. The months dragged on, and with each passing week, the distance between them grew heavier, more unbearable. What once had been secret moments of tenderness had turned into an unspoken war of silence. She, the billionaire boss, carried herself like nothing was wrong, like the child in her womb was a miracle shaped only by her world, untouched by the janitor who once stood by her side. And he, the man who had loved her in secret, became a ghost walking through the halls, his presence reduced to nothing more than the sound of his mop scraping against marble. But in the eyes of others, suspicion had already taken root. The staff whispered when she passed, exchanging glances that spoke louder than words. They noticed how her complexion shifted under certain lights, how her child might carry traits that would raise uncomfortable questions. Among them, the cruelest jokes began to form, jokes about a janitor reaching where no one thought he could, jokes about forbidden unions that would never be acknowledged. And each laugh cut him like a blade. For him, every day was torment. He was forced to clean the very office where she signed deals worth millions, forced to stand silent when her powerful friends congratulated her on her perfect little family-to-be. He wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to shout that the life inside her belonged to him too. But he didn't, because he knew how the world would twist it. He was not just a worker. He was a black man, and in their eyes his truth would always be seen as a lie. And she? She grew more ruthless in her denial. She told her family fabricated stories of a wealthy European businessman who had swept her off her feet before vanishing. She invented details about vacations that never happened, about romance painted in exotic colors. And her family, clinging desperately to their own illusions of respectability, accepted it without question, because it was easier to believe in fantasy than to face the truth that their perfect daughter had crossed a line society would never forgive. But the janitor could not escape. He saw her every day. He saw the glow of pregnancy transform into weariness, saw the way she hid her swelling belly beneath designer gowns, saw the way she flinched when strangers asked about the father. He knew she was living in fear, not fear of the child, but fear of what the child would reveal. One day, it all came crashing down. The office buzzed with energy. Executives gathered for a meeting, clients filled the lobby, and the air was thick with tension. The janitor was scrubbing the floor outside the boardroom when he heard them. Voices sharp and cutting, slicing through the air like knives. They were mocking him. "Have you noticed," one executive sneered, "how the boss's baby might not look exactly like us?" Another laughed. "Careful. You don't want to say too much, but between you and me, I've seen the way she looks at that janitor. You know the one. Always lurking around. The laughter that followed was cruel, dripping with malice. They spoke about him as though he were dirt beneath their shoes, an embarrassment not even worth dignity. He gripped his mop tighter, his knuckles white, his chest burning with rage. He wanted to storm into the room and confront them all, to demand respect, to claim his child openly. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because to speak was to risk everything, to risk being fired, being humiliated, being branded a liar once more. And yet, as he walked away, something inside him broke. The injustice was too heavy, the silence too loud. He realized then that this wasn't just about her denial. This was about the world itself, the way it stripped men like him of their humanity, the way it erased his role as a father before he even had the chance to hold his child. Meanwhile, her own fear began to spiral. She noticed the way people looked at her differently now, how conversations seemed to stop when she entered the room. She felt the unspoken weight of curiosity pressing down on her every time someone asked about the baby. In the privacy of her penthouse, she stood before the mirror, one hand resting on her stomach, and whispered lies to herself. It will be fine. No one will ever know. The truth will never come out. But deep down, she knew. The night the conflict reached its peak was at another gathering, a charity event where her wealth was paraded for cameras, where her generosity was praised in glossy magazines. She wore a silver gown that hugged her pregnant figure, and she smiled as flashbulbs lit up the room. To the outside world, she was flawless. But in the corner, unseen by the cameras, stood the janitor once again. He had been ordered to serve drinks, to blend into the background like the invisible man he had always been. But as he moved among the guests, he caught fragments of their words. They were speculating again. "Do you think the child will look like her?" one woman whispered. "Or will it reveal a different story?" another replied. The laughter that followed was soft, polite, but it carried the venom of judgment. And then it happened. One of the guests, drunk, careless, cruel, approached her directly. He raised his glass and smirked, saying just loud enough for others to hear, "Tell me, darling, should we expect the baby to have your eyes? Or the janitor's?" The room went silent. Her smile faltered, her hands clenched, her heart thundered, and in that silence, every eye turned toward her. The janitor froze, his tray trembling in his hands. Time seemed to stop. She forced a laugh, deflecting, brushing it off as an outrageous joke. But the damage was done. The seed of suspicion had been planted in public, where no amount of money could bury it again. That night, she lashed out. She summoned the janitor after the event, cornered him in the shadows of the mansion's service entrance. Her words were venomous. She accused him of ruining everything, of daring to exist where he didn't belong, of almost exposing her secret. He stood there, silent, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply looked at her one last time, a look filled with hurt, love, rage, and resignation, and walked away. From that night on, the air between them was poisoned. She carried her pregnancy in secrecy, while he carried his heartbreak in silence. The closer the birth approached, the heavier the weight became. The world was watching now, waiting for the truth to be revealed. And she knew that when the child came, no lie could protect her forever, because some truths cannot be hidden. Not by money, not by power, not even by fear. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the walls and refuses to let go. In the hospital room, she lay on the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her hands trembling as contractions tore through her body. The monitors beeped steadily, nurses moved with urgency, and yet She felt utterly alone. Her family was there, gathered in the waiting room, offering polished smiles to the doctors, shielding their fear with wealth and arrogance. They whispered among themselves about the important new heir, already calculating how the child would be celebrated in their circles of power. None of them dared to question, not out loud, but deep in their hearts, doubt lurked like a shadow. The janitor was nowhere near them. He had not been invited, had not even been told when the moment arrived. Yet somehow he knew. As he finished his shift that evening, his body pulled him toward the hospital. He didn't walk in through the grand entrance where her family gathered. Instead, he lingered outside, pacing in the shadows, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He couldn't be there as her partner. He couldn't be there as her equal. But in his soul, he knew he was connected to the life about to enter the world. Inside the room, the hours dragged. Pain gripped her body, but a different kind of pain gnawed at her mind. She kept repeating the lie she had built for herself. No one will know. The baby will look like me. This will pass. But another voice whispered louder, what if? What if the truth is written on the child's face? And then the cry pierced the air, a baby's first cry, loud, pure, undeniable. The nurses worked quickly, wrapping the newborn, placing the child gently in her arms. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat, her world shattering in an instant. For in the baby's face, there was no denial. The deep brown of the skin, the shape of the nose, the curl of the hair, it was all there. Features that told a story louder than words. Features that no amount of wealth or fabricated tales could erase. Her heart stopped. She wanted to scream, to push the child away, to deny what her eyes were seeing. But she couldn't, because the truth was staring back at her, raw and undeniable. This was not the child of some invented European businessman. This was his child, the janitor's child. The nurses exchanged glances. One looked at her with hesitation as though silently acknowledging what they all saw. Even in the quiet professionalism of the room, judgment lingered in the air. The truth could not be hidden anymore. Her family rushed in moments later, their faces glowing with excitement, ready to celebrate. But as they gathered around the bed and peered into the baby's face, their expressions shifted. Smiles faltered. Conversations stumbled. A heavy silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. One relative finally broke the quiet, his voice strained and sharp. Whose child? Is this? She froze, her throat dry, her hands trembling as she clutched the baby tighter. The denial she had built for months threatened to crumble, but she clung to it desperately. She mumbled excuses, something about recessive genes, distant relatives, unusual traits. But no one believed her. Not truly. The truth was too clear. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the janitor felt his chest tighten. Though he hadn't seen the child yet, something inside him shifted. It was as if his soul knew. His blood now lived outside him, breathing, crying, existing in a world that wanted to erase him. News spread quickly. Whispers filled the hospital corridors, rumors ran through the staff, and before long, the scandal reached the city's social circles. A billionaire's child, born with features that told a different story than the one she wanted the world to believe. People speculated, gossiped, dissected the truth as though it were entertainment. But beneath the noise, one reality stood clear. Her secret had been exposed. She sat in her hospital bed, staring at her baby, torn between love and fear. The child was innocent, perfect, and yet in her eyes, also dangerous. Dangerous because every time she looked into her baby's face, she saw him, the janitor she had tried so hard to erase. The man whose existence now lived on in her legacy, and in that moment she realized the depth of her mistake. She could deny him in public, she could lie to her family, but she could not deny the truth written in her child's skin. A truth that would follow her for the rest of her life. For the janitor, the moment of truth came hours later. As he lingered in the hospital corridor, one of the nurses who pitied him whispered softly as she passed, "She looks just like you." Those words broke him open. Tears filled his eyes as he pressed his back against the wall, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and pain. He wasn't there to hold his daughter, wasn't allowed inside to claim her. But in that moment, He knew the truth was alive. His bloodline had spoken for him, and with that truth, everything changed. The billionaire boss could no longer hide behind her walls of wealth. Her denial had collapsed, her reputation cracked, and though she still tried to maintain control, the child's face told the story she could never bury again. It was the climax of everything they had lived, the lies, the secrecy, the injustice, and now the world would never look at them the same way again. The baby's cries filled the hospital room, but to her, each sound was an echo of truth she could not escape. She held her child tightly, her arms trembling, while her family stood frozen, their faces painted with shock, disappointment, and anger. They had built their lives on prestige, power, and appearances, and in one instant, all of it seemed to unravel. One of her brothers was the first to lash out. His voice dripped with venom as he hissed, "Do you realize what you've done? Do you realize how this will look? Our name, our reputation, it's finished." She said nothing. Words caught in her throat like stones. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that love, even forbidden love, had led her here. But she couldn't. Because in her world, love was never enough. Status mattered more. Skin color mattered more. And now, the truth of her betrayal stood cradled in her arms, innocent and pure, yet condemned by the weight of prejudice. Her parents tried to mask their horror, forcing polite smiles whenever doctors or nurses entered, but the silence between them was thick with judgment. They avoided her eyes, avoided the baby, as if ignoring reality could erase it. But reality cannot be erased. It grows louder, bolder, demanding to be seen. Outside the hospital, the janitor paced the cold pavement, unable to leave. He wanted desperately to see his daughter, to hold her just once, to whisper promises of love into her tiny ears. But he knew he wasn't welcome inside. To them, he was just a worker, an outsider. To them, he wasn't worthy of stepping into the same room. And yet he stayed, because leaving felt like abandoning a part of himself. When word spread through the city, the reaction was swift and merciless. Newspapers didn't print the whole truth, but the whispers told the story anyway. Social circles buzzed with scandal. Neighbors speculated in hushed tones. Some saw it as gossip to devour, others as proof of everything they believed about race, class, and forbidden lines. A billionaire woman stained by the presence of a man they considered beneath her. For him, the weight was unbearable. He became the subject of ridicule, of sly jokes whispered in the workplace. His co-workers taunted him, some out of envy, others out of cruelty. They called him a fool for thinking he could belong to a world that was never meant for him. And yet, even through the humiliation, he carried something stronger: pride. Because no matter what the world said, he knew the truth. His child existed. His blood lived on. And nothing, no lie, no denial could take that from him. For her, life became a prison. She tried to go back to her old routines, to reclaim her image as the untouchable businesswoman. But every time she walked into a boardroom, she felt the stares, the questions unspoken but heavy in the air. Every time she attended a gala, she heard the whispers ripple through the crowd. And worst of all, every time she looked at her child, she saw the man she had betrayed. At first, she tried to hide. She kept the baby away from cameras, away from public eyes. She dressed her in clothes that concealed, avoided conversations about the father, and refused to acknowledge the truth. But as the child grew, it became impossible to deny. Her daughter carried the unmistakable features of her father: the curl of her hair, the depth of her eyes, the richness of her skin. They spoke louder than any denial she could utter. The turning point came when the child was 3 years old. She had taken her to the park, hoping for a quiet afternoon. But instead, a stranger approached her, a woman who had heard the stories. The woman looked down at the child and smiled kindly, before saying words that cut deeper than knives. "She's beautiful. Looks just like her father." In that moment, she felt the walls she had built collapse. The lies, the denial, the anger, it all seemed meaningless against the truth shining from her child's face. And for the first time, she realized that her fight had never been with him, or even with the world. It had been with herself. Her fear of judgment, her obsession with reputation, her refusal to embrace love that didn't fit the mold. That night, she cried. Not the polished tears of a woman worried about appearances, but the raw, painful sobs of someone who had lost more than she had gained. She had lost him, the man who had loved her despite everything. She had lost the chance to build a family rooted in truth. And though she had her daughter, she knew that her child would one day ask the question she feared most. Who is my father? And when that day came, no lie would ever be enough. The janitor, meanwhile, lived a quieter life. He never fought for recognition, never demanded a place in the child's life, but he carried her in his heart every single day. He would pass by the park sometimes, watching from a distance as she played, his eyes filled with pride and sorrow. He didn't approach. He didn't intrude. He simply stood in the shadows, a silent guardian, knowing that his love was present even if his presence was not. Years later, when the child was old enough to notice the cracks in her mother's stories, she asked the question her mother had dreaded. Who is my dad? And though the billionaire boss tried to avoid it, the truth was already written in her daughter's reflection. The story spread beyond their circle, whispered as a cautionary tale. To some, it was a scandal about wealth and betrayal. To others, it was a painful reminder of how deeply racism and class prejudice still scarred society. But to those who listened closely, it was something more. It was a story about truth, about how love cannot be erased, and about how the face of a child can silence every lie. The billionaire boss learned, too late, that money could not control reality. The janitor learned that silence could not erase his role as a father, and the world was left with a lesson that injustice, no matter how carefully hidden, will always find its way to the surface. So as the years passed, the child grew, carrying with her not just the weight of her parents' choices, but the strength of her own truth. And every time someone looked at her and said, "You look just like your father," the story was told again, not through words, but through the undeniable legacy written on her face. And maybe that is the question left for all of us. How many truths do we bury in fear of judgment? How many loves do we deny because the world says they don't fit? And when the time comes, will we have the courage to face the truth, or will we be forced like her to see it reflected in the eyes of an innocent child?